take the seed from the cucumber I want to eat. I have to let one of those cucumbers get big and yellow and ugly and mushy and nothing I would ever want to eat before I know that seed is really going to be ripe. Stuff that's almost on the borderline of rotting is going to have, you know, mature seed inside of it. And when I'm collecting seed, I want to make sure I'm collecting seed from my best specimens, the best stuff out there, the stuff I like the best. And I want to make sure I collect seed from a variety of different fruits, not just seed from one fruit. I want to take it from several different fruits. If you start collecting seed, just saving seed from one fruit year after year after year, an issue that can happen is called inbred depression, where you don't have the genetic diversity to basically keep your stock vigorous. And so if you collect from various individuals in your crop, it's a lot better than just taking from one plant to avoid that depression. And we see that more in plants that make male and female flowers, more so than plants that have male and female flowers in the same flower. So like tomato seeds are not as likely to have inbred depression as things like squash or something like that. You had a question, please?
So I think it happened once or twice that you have a tomato on the vine and you pull off the vine with several tomatoes and kind of let them sit there and then they start propagating inside the tomato.
Okay.
So then what are those are seeds that are already propagated. So I thought, well, maybe I could plant the whole tomato or something. Are those already like spent seeds?
Well, first of all, it's kind of rare for tomatoes to propagate inside themselves because they have that jelly that's around the seed is supposed to be inhibit germination, and they tell you that's very important to get cleaned off if you do want to germinate your own tomatoes, and you have to do that with vinegar or hot water or even let them start to ferment a little bit. But if they do start getting nasty and start fermenting a little bit on their own, that's a natural way for them to self-clean. And I have noticed that especially in citrus and stuff before you got a little bit of a sprout coming on inside the fruit. But in that case, generally speaking, your season is going to be way off for growing it. You know, if you're harvesting that tomato in August, you're not going to grow that seed. You can't save that seed if it's already started to germinate. But it is true that you harvest tomatoes hopefully when they're botanically ripe, and so that's one good example of a crop that, oh, that tomato was the best, I'm going to save the seed from it, you know. But if you're doing other things like squash, that the timing of harvest is different, or beans, green beans or something like that, and you think, oh, this plant was the best, put a little flag on it and let some of those seeds get more mature so you know that this is the plant that I want to save from. Related, yes?
I was wondering about, like you take, like I wanted to do berries from the salad.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I just take the berries and dry the berries, or if I should open up the fruit and, you know, dry the seeds from that. I've just been doing the fruit and drying that and then, you know, trying that, but I'm not sure that's the right
I'm
way.
going to mention that I haven't personally grown those two crops from seed, but we've purchased a lot of stock that's grown from seed, and I know it's very possible. I'll also say that all the information related to seed growing is empirical, and so it's not all hard science. And so what works for you is the most important thing. I think that most of the growers I've talked to that have been propagating stuff like salal and huckleberries by seed are cleaning the seeds. So they're trying to separate those seeds from the pulp, and that's you know, to prevent stuff from rotting especially. And for storage ability. And I'll mention that a lot of these crops that are perennials that make a seed crop in the fall are going to need to go through some kind of winter chilling period to be able to germinate again. So you might have to sow those seeds in the fall and not expect anything to come up until springtime, because they need to go through that cold, dormant period that's part of its natural cycle. So things like apples are a great example of something that needs to go through what's called vernalization. And so if it goes through a winter chill, it releases this inherent dormancy that's in the seed. Some seeds have a really hard seed coat on them, and that'll keep them from germinating. And they might need to be what's called scarified, or make a little phylum a little bit, or something like that. They might germinate best when they've passed through the gut of an animal. So think about solal and huckleberry. Birds are going to be the standard mode of action for that. So you might have to simulate that by, some kind of treatment with a mild acid to stimulate a stomach acid, or like hot water or something to just completely rinse any growth inhibitor off of that. Yes?
I ordered some sequoia and Japanese black pine seeds.
Okay.
And I read someplace that if you just plant them in a pot, set them outside where they get rain and cold and stuff, you don't have to put them in the refrigerator for that cold period.
Uh-huh.
And it works great.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It can kind of my lazy gardening kit.
Yeah. If you want to speed things up and be really in control of the whole process, putting things in the refrigerator, whatever, is a good way to do it. But if you have things that are generally well suited for your climate, like these fir trees and stuff, even a sequoia used to be native here to Western Washington. You can, use the natural environment to, do all that extra work for you. Just sow it in an area where you're not worried about something eating it or digging it up, like a little squirrel or something like that, and you're going to be in safe shape. Okay, so collecting seed, go for it is all I want to say. There's not, try it in some form. You're going to have a good time, and you're going to be able to share that experience with other people, especially in the fruits of your labors. It's really, really fun. You can name it your own thing when you're done with it, especially if you start doing seed breeding. And I'm going to call this the highest level of gardening, because the best seed breeders are generally the most remembered gardeners. We can think of people like Luther Burbank is responsible for the russet Burbank potato, pears, all these things. He's 100 years ago, the guy we still remember. You can think of George Washington Carver and developing these peanut varieties that we still use today. And these people were not just scientists. They said, both of those two individuals said that they talked to their plants.
Yeah.
And so they weren't just looking at things completely academically. They were producing things that were very valuable with some kind of practiced intuitive knowledge. Related to seed breeding and making your own varieties, I'll say it's not always that easy, because there's a lot of cross-pollination potential. So if you are trying to grow your own kale, you can't have any shotweed growing next to your kale. You can't have cabbage growing next to your kale. You can't have all those other brassicas growing around, because they'll cross-pollinate and mix up your genetics. And so it takes a fair amount of isolation for some of our crops, especially if they're bee pollinated or wind pollinated or whatever. If you're trying to grow corn that's heirloom corn that you save year after year, you can't grow that hybrid corn next to your heirloom corn, because it's going to cross-pollinate, and you're going to end up with contaminated genetics, basically. And so there's some degree of difficulty with a lot of things, but stuff that's really easy to start with: tomatoes, peas, beans, all those are really, really easy things to save seeds from. It can get a little more challenging when you're doing squash, but a really cool thing about squash is you can create changes really fast, and there's so much variety available out there. I could breed this with maybe an orange pumpkin, because I really like the flavor of this, but I like the look of the pumpkin. And then I've got a whole crop that might be all kind of mixed up, and I might have a bunch of different stuff, but then I'll find that one in the group that I really like a lot, and I'll just breed that one. And then I'll continue breeding those for a few years, and eventually I'll have a strain that is pumpkin looking with flavor like this guy, and it's going to be exactly what I wanted. And so it won't take more than 4 or 5 seasons maybe before I've got a variety that's fairly stable and is different than anything I can buy commercially. And once again, this book is a really good one for Breed Your Own Vegetable Varieties by Carol Depp is a really good book for explaining the basics and the advanced stuff for growing your own vegetable varieties by variety, so you can get an idea for what it takes to grow the crop that you really want to grow. Other thing about that is, last thing I'll say about breeding, I'll just leave you with this quote from Thomas Jefferson. If you are getting into plant breeding, a great quote is, "The greatest service which can be rendered in any country is to add a useful plant to its culture." And so it's the best legacy you can leave as a gardener. The variety that you make, like Luther Burbank, like George Washington Carver, if it's good, it's going to be around. And it's a very important legacy, more than any endowment fund or anything else like that. So it's very important to consider. Okay, so politics. Oh, I'm not going to end with politics, but I'll keep going on politics. It's not polite to talk about religion or politics, and I've gotten into both here. So let's keep going on that. Plant patents. So that's a kind of a newer thing. I mentioned they came about in 1980, and they're becoming increasingly common. Basically, if you're a plant breeder nowadays and you got a new variety, you have to patent your plant. And it's kind of annoying because as a purchaser of plants, I have to pay royalties on all those things, and I'm then not allowed to regrow that. And it's also quite confusing. So there are a lot of plants that are patented. Even plants that are organic can be patented. Even plants that are open pollinated, meaning you can collect that seed. And even plants, some of them that are considered heirlooms, can be patented. So if I've got my great-great-great-grandmother's bean that I'm growing in my garden and I'm the only one that has it, I can patent that heirloom. And so that's kind of a crazy thing to me. So really, I think an heirloom is something that has to be given physically to you by someone, and to call something an heirloom that you buy at the store is kind of disingenuous to me. It's like buying someone else's family jewels. It just doesn't have the same meaning, So the idea with the patents is that it just kind of restricts our freedoms a little bit as growers. So if you are growing something in your home garden that is patented, you're obliged not to collect seed from that. In most cases, they're going to be F1 hybrids that aren't going to produce stable seed anyway. But it gets a little bit tricky when you don't know if it's patented or not, because the literature is not all consistent. So the people that are selling seeds at the retail level, like Twilly Seeds or Johnny Seeds or Young Seeds and Plants, they are probably going to list if their material is patented on there, but they might not necessarily. I was looking through a bunch of these catalogs this morning and seeing a lot of discrepancy between what one grower lists as patented and what the other one doesn't. And so I noticed that on a lot of things that are already hybrids, they don't even bother listing that it's a patented hybrid because they don't fear that it's going to be reproduced. But it's still a patented thing. And so there are various different types of plant patents. And so most of the most basic types are plant variety patents, or PVPs, and you'll see that in the seed catalogs and on some seed packets. And that basically means you're not allowed to reproduce and sell that. If you're just a home gardener, you might be able to do that without getting in trouble, but generally speaking, the language on the patents is vague enough so that if there's somebody that is reproducing patented material, even if they're just a garden club selling it as a fundraiser, they're vulnerable to litigation. And so there are also more strict plant patents, like utility patents that exist. And so if you have a plant that's utility patented, PUP, then you can't even do research on that plant. You can't publish any research on how it does. So I wouldn't be able to legally grow it in my tomato trial or something like that. And so because there's different types of plant patents, and they have fairly vague language related to what the patents really protect, there's a lot of kind of legal gray area for seed savers and consumers. And so I understand the idea that they're producing value for the seed breeders, but I do want to recognize that 90% of the world's seed is controlled by 3 seed companies. And so there are very few seed breeders left. And if you are a seed breeder, you're probably owned by a parent company. So there isn't a lot of standard breeding practices happening today compared to what there used to be by major seed companies. And so that has to happen at the ground level with all of us. So if we want that to continue happening, we have to make that choice to participate in that process. And we're not really supposed to do that by buying patented seeds. So just keep that in mind. That said, there's a lot of research though happening with genetically modified seed, and so genetically engineered things, and there's a lot of different methods for genetic engineering too. There's gene transfer, there's gene editing, there's it's kind of a new thing. The first GMO crop that came out was in 1995 for sale. That was the Flavor Savor tomato, and that was pulled off the shelves really immediately because it tasted so bad. It was supposed to be improved shelf life for this tomato, but the flavor was poor enough that they didn't continue marketing that. But the year after that, they made BT corn, and so the quality, meaning that it has a pesticide in it that protects the plant from worms, basically, from predation from caterpillars. And so a lot of crops that are maybe not so important for flavor, like corn, soy, alfalfa, are genetically engineered now, especially to have herbicide resistance or a certain degree of insect resistance. And as far as I know, there are no genetically modified crops that have been made to improve flavor or nutrition. And so the lesson with the Flavor Savor tomato was that when you try to change a specific gene, you change a whole host of other functions in that plant that are related to that specific gene. So one gene doesn't control one thing in the genetic makeup of the plant. One gene might be related to a whole host of functions, and tampering with that one might have consequences that aren't exactly intended. And in crops that are not as flavorful or more just like bulk dry ingredients like grains, we might not notice those so much in terms of flavor because it looks the same, but there might be differences in our body's ability to process those things that we don't necessarily know yet because they're pretty new. And so there's a lot of, in the industry it seems like it's more like push it through, say it's safe, and be proven wrong later. And if they are proven wrong later, then we'll pull it off the market. But there's been not nearly enough time to prove whether all these things are environmentally safe over the long term or even safe on a public health basis over the long term. So the idea that we're going to be making plants that are more tolerant to drought and more tolerant to pests and reduce our need for fungicide and pesticide and all that stuff is just not being realized yet. And I'm sure that is the goal of most of the scientists that are working on these things, but from the commercial application standpoint, what we're really doing is breeding plants that A, don't rot, which means they're not going to be as easy for us to digest, or they're going to be able to tolerate herbicide, which we will also have to ingest. And so it was surprising to me when I read a list, and I printed some of them on the back here from a magazine that came out this month. These are all patented seeds and really common things that most people like to grow from seeds, and there are all types of different varieties that are patented. So if you're curious about what you're saving seed from, if you're really allowed to do that or not, you might consider this list. And so I've put a bunch of things in italics, and so anything in italics is going to be something that's open pollinated, meaning you should be able to just harvest seed from that plant without it changing types like a hybrid, or whether it's organic, which also, or whether it's heirloom, which also means open pollinated but older. And so just if you're curious about the types of seed that you pick out every year, if they're if there are rules about how you might be able to proceed with saving that seed, this I think is an interesting reference. But what I want to leave with, I'll just talk about a few of my favorite plants from seed since they're sitting right here. I'll start down here with the filbert, the nut tree. Oh, it's making its flower. Look at all that pollen. Oh.